Okay, well, hi there. It's Dr. Brendan Flynn from the School of Political Science and Sociology. I'm starting this webinar and I'm going to try and keep it quite informal because it'd be much nicer to do this in person because I don't know who's attending. It's a bit disembodied. I see there's 9, 10 people joining. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes explaining a bit of the background of why I'm interested in Irish defence policy, which is pretty, for some people, I suppose, quite a strange topic, and they'd say, who could be interested in that? The usual answer I get from people is, have you a background in the defence forces, or did you serve in the army or something like that? And the answer to that is no, I have no background like that whatsoever, but I've been interested in defence and security policy for quite a while. And my primary interest for most of my academic career is environmental stuff. So it's quite, you might think, quite different, but of course, there are connections and there are areas of overlap, particularly climate security, which our Taoiseach Micheál Martin was talking about at the United Nations Security Council just about a week ago or 2 weeks ago. I actually got interested in security and Irish security and defence arrangements because of my interest in teaching European politics, and it's cropped up in some of those referendum, the Lisbon Treaty and the Nice Treaty, right? So if you've been involved in those or sucked into the vortex of all of those, you got interested in debates about Irish neutrality and security and so on. And of course, the other way is through maritime issues, because I had a project on maritime policy going back years now, and I got interested in the Navy and what they were doing. So that's kind of why I ended up interested in the defence forces. But as I go to explain, there's a bit of a conceptual overlap between the defence forces as a state organisation of considerable importance, and then defence policy, which is not exactly the same thing, but is actually much wider. It might be appropriate now for me to do the dreaded PowerPoint screen share. I don't know if you're joining me at lunchtime and you've just come from another Zoom meeting or a Microsoft Teams meeting. I don't know, can you handle another slideshow? But hopefully this isn't too crazy. And I think I've just got 5 slides and I'm going to talk about those. I should say as well that what I'm also going to do, hopefully, is I'm going to allow, not hopefully, I'm going to allow time for people to ask questions. So as I roll through it and explain this research project a little bit that I'm at the moment, because it is actually a definitive research project I have, you might have a burning question, or potentially I say something that is a howler, or you find you want to take exception to, or you want to come back at me straight away. So you could put your hand up and I might see it. I'm just looking here at the taskbar and I'm just trying to manipulate that a little bit, pull it over. Yeah, and you could put a question into the Q&A. You can't use the chat function. I think that's disabled in this webinar model. So that's an Irish soldier hard at work on a UN peacekeeping operation at UNIFIL or UNDOF in the Golan Heights. I think it's UNIFIL. And so my project that I'm working with is actually funded by the small grant scheme from the College of Arts, Humanities and Celtic Studies. So I want to extend a big thank you to the small funding scheme for research projects that is administered by the College of Arts, because without them, I probably wouldn't have done this. And they just prodded me to do it. And I was talking to an Irish academic who shall be nameless, who said I should go and do some research in this area because I was, his quote, fierce interested in it, whatever that means. And he said, you should go and do a bit of research on it. So that's actually the genesis of this project. So it began, I suppose, I sketched it out during the COVID period, and I only got to do some of it. I started it really at the beginning of the summer, and I've been doing interviews throughout the summer, and I've been doing interviews, including interviews last week. Just a little word of warning, any views that are expressed here by me are the views of Brendan Flynn. They do not reflect any organizations that I work for, including NUIG, or any organizations I work with. They certainly don't reflect the views of the Defence Forces. So I'm speaking on my own behalf. I'm not giving you some other kind of reality of some other organization. Where do I start? What's the rationale for this? Why would somebody go and do research on Irish defence policy? And the simple answer is it's in the news. And if you look out there, you'll see there's plenty of examples of how Irish defence policy and relatedly the situation of the defence forces has come into the news. The one picture I didn't put up there, of course, is the horrific, absolutely horrific situation involving the so-called Women of Honour, I think is the title being used to describe it. That's the name of the programme, an amazing piece of journalism, which has uncovered a very, very unpleasant and very serious issue for the defence forces involving, I think, systematic discrimination and also neglect in terms of dealing with the process to deal with sexual harassment, including at the higher level, it seems, credible accusations of sexual assault and rape. So it doesn't really come more serious than that. So the defence forces right now is in a very bad place because it has that very serious issue hanging over it. But in fact, the last 5 years have seen quite a lot of what I would call contestation of defence and the defence forces. To be honest, most of it has been about the defence forces, not about defence policy. So we see there on the left-hand corner of the screen, Cathal Berry, who himself was a former member of the defence forces and subsequently qualified as a doctor. He was elected as an independent in the constituency for Kildare, which has a big army vote, and he's an independent member of the parliament, and he's very activist on issues of what you would call pay conditions, welfare, and the overall climate of the defence forces. But he also has strong opinions on defence policy and that the defence forces, you know, should be better funded and have clearer missions, and there should be greater ambition for defence in Ireland. So he's a real advocate for the defence force, and the fact that he could actually get elected and on what you might call the sort of, in that constituency, concern about defence matters is interesting. And I would suggest to you that the political system takes note of that. Now, he is only one independent TD, and it's important to point out there are other political parties and voices who have their own very distinctive views on defence policy. There's also a commission on the defence forces in work and in play, and there's nothing I want to say today should be taken as a criticism of the commission, or I'm not doing a piece of research which is trying to figure out what the commission is at. My research is basically trying to look at what's going on in Irish defence policy from round about the year 2000, when there was a white paper on defence, or when there was a defence policy statement, and around about the period of 9/11, which has shaped, you know, global security situation with the war on terror, the so-called war on terror, and the whole Afghanistan situation. So those last 20 years, so from 2000 to 2020, more or less, is what I'm looking at. So I'm actually not looking at the commission, or I'm not interviewing people who are engaged in the work of the commission, which seem to be doing quite a lot of work. They have a very good website where they have their minutes up. But the commission is a sign that Irish defence policy and arrangements are actually being contested. Incidentally, this is part of an international trend whereby militaries, which were traditionally very unusual organizations hidden behind the barracks wall, are through social media engaged in greater political agitation over issues of gender equality, issues of discrimination against women, issues of family friendly, issues of pay, issues of condition, issues of post-traumatic stress, issues of veterans. All of these things are being fought out through social media challenges. So the old days when Western militaries were sort of silent organizations behind the barracks wall are long gone. This is now a matter which is fought out in social media and in regular media. And of course, the poster over there on the right-hand side, Irish troops out of Mali. And there was an interesting piece in the local free sheet Galway Advertiser about why somebody thought Ireland shouldn't be sending peacekeepers to Mali. And of course, they wanted to send the soldiers to the Spanish Arch, where our students are drinking, or allegedly drinking, if they are allegedly our students. It's a kind of humorous kind of quip on quite a serious issue. It shows you that the neutrality issue hasn't kind of gone away. And I say this to students when I'm teaching it. So the other big development that isn't yet coming out, but it will come out very soon, is there's a national security strategy being worked on. And there was a call for expressions of opinion and consultation on the national security strategy, which is being undertaken by an official in the Department of the Taoiseach, which those of you who know these things will know that the defence portfolio was actually being administered by a Minister of State under the Department of the Taoiseach. Now the defence portfolio has moved to the Department of Foreign Affairs, and it's being managed by Simon Coveney, along with his Foreign Ministry responsibilities. So defense has shifted around. You have to go back a while to find an actual Minister for Defense, a full cabinet Minister for Defense, and you can draw your own conclusions about that. But my point here is that there's actually quite a lot happening on Irish defense and security, and there's quite a lot of contestation or politicization about it. So what we see here is there is actually a debate. The last one about the Mali thing doesn't explicitly mention neutrality, but I think there are a bunch of people engaged in politics, and there's a section of the electorate for whom the issue of neutrality is important, and they are possibly concerned about greater European activity and greater European ambition on security and defence. And that then means somebody should come in and say, well, what does all this mean for neutrality and our unusual position on that? So I have a couple of research questions, because you're supposed to have research questions, aren't you? Right? You're supposed to do that. But let me just go to the end of that list, and that is to say, this is interview-based research. I decided I wasn't going to do archival work and all that. What I like to do in my work is I'm not a quantitative person. I don't do regression analysis. Basically, probably because I'm too stupid to understand what the maths involved can let me do. But I have no disrespect for people who do quantitative work, but that's not just what I do. What I love to do is interview-based research, but it's tricky to do, and it's especially tricky to do with this project. But what I have been very pleasantly surprised with is when I asked politely and clearly, from civil servants at a very high level in the Department of Defense, could I do some interviews with them, and people in the serving military, and I'll come back to them in a minute. Could I do some interviews with them about this topic? I expected to be told, no, thank you. We don't engage. We don't do comments like this. And in fact, what I was told is, thank you for asking us. We've been waiting for people to engage with us, and we're very happy to give you interviews. Now, the interviews are anonymous. I don't identify people by name. I might generically identify that they're a civil servant or that they're a serving or retired military person. Also notice that I'm interviewing academics, and I'm also interviewing what I would call NGO and party political people, or people who have a more political position on defense policy, which I think is essential, because defense policy is essentially a political question. What should we be doing in the world? How should we be using our armed forces? That those are essentially political questions. So you have to talk to political people about that. But I find the serving military people very interesting. And I just want to say that it's very tricky for them to comment, because they cannot make comment on government policy. There's a civil military divide, and military people are under military law. They also have to be very mindful of operational security and confidentiality. They would be a little bit cautious about somebody fishing for information to try and get something controversial or salacious or something like that. But they have been very open with me and very generous in their time, and very reflective in their comments as military professionals who are serving. And I think that's extraordinary. So I'm very grateful for the interviews I've done so far. Also, retired military people are really, really interesting people, because some of these people they have incredible CVs, and they're very impressive people, almost without fault. Sometimes their opinions are incredibly forthright and bullish, but they're always worth listening to, and they have interesting comments and interesting observations. So that's actually what the research project is about. Now, I'm not going to go into. Somebody can ask me questions about what I found, but I'm not going to tell you yet. You'll have to wait for the research when it comes out, and I think that would be a breach of my duty of care towards the people I'm interviewing, who I'm incredibly grateful for. Here's my questions, and the question I'm asking a lot of people in the interviews is, what has changed? Has anything actually changed in the last 20 years on defence in Ireland? And I've got very interesting arguments. Almost nobody has come up with the idea that there's been a revolution, that Ireland's dramatically changed its defence policy. Some people have gone with the idea that there has been an evolution, and that in actual fact it's quite significant. Like a lot of evolutions, you don't notice small incremental changes, but before you know it, and I speak as a father who's a teenage boy, before you know it, the little kid grows up and they're a huge teenager which towers over you. And Irish defence policy has had some evolutionary changes. That's what I think there is actually a falsifiable proposition there. The argument for continuity is also a runner as well, that some things haven't changed, but I can get into that a little bit more detail. I suppose what some people would be very interested in, and I think it has come up in dull debates, particularly from the political left in Ireland, which of course is a plural left. We have a very diverse left-wing caucus in the Irish Parliament now, which consists of Sinn Féin, which is the second largest party. And if you look at some of the trends, could actually become the largest party in the future election. We have the Labour Party, we have a Social Democratic Party, and then we have, a variety of small and then some independent left-wing candidates who are very vocal and well able to articulate their views on particularly on this issue. And I think some of them have made the argument that Ireland is in a kind of a slow, steady trajectory to ditch neutrality. And in fact, I think that is very open to debate. And in fact, the evidence might actually point the other way, that the neutrality idea, the neutrality identity, and I think that's the way to really think about it, has remained remarkably stable. And in actual fact, if anything, it's locking in. It's not going away. I should explain to those of you who are not following European politics or are not interested in security and defense, Sweden and Finland have been two countries that we've often been put in the same basket or bucket with. And I think we're actually quite different from them, but we're even more different now because they really are moving away from neutrality. They don't describe themselves as neutral countries anymore. They describe themselves technically as non-aligned. But since 2014, both Finland and Sweden have signed an agreement with NATO, which changes their status with NATO. We have a partnership for peace agreement with NATO, along with a huge number of countries. The partnership for peace is a cooperation agreement. It is really no more than that. But the relationship between Finland and Sweden with NATO now is much stronger. And NATO have this thing called enhanced partner status or host nation status, which is basically Premier League access to NATO. So you're not a member of NATO, but you have special friends with benefits kind of rights with NATO. So there's an ambiguity there. There's a fundamental ambiguity about Finnish neutrality and Swedish neutrality. And of course, they're in a geographical area where they're facing a renewed Russian threat. So again, that's quite different from Ireland. In fact, Ireland's a little bit isolated now because we're the last, the Mohicans. We're the last of the truly non-aligned countries, along with possibly Austria. Remember that Switzerland is a neutral country, but Switzerland's outside the European Union. So if you're looking for two European Union states which are not interested in joining NATO and are generally described as non-aligned and are cooperative peacekeepers, either through a United Nations or an EU framework, or indeed other frameworks, then Austria and Ireland would fit that bill. But I think Sweden and Finland have moved a little bit away from that. By the way, they both still do peacekeeping. They haven't given up on peacekeeping, but they're in a different space than us in terms of their non-alignment. And in fact, you can ask major questions about their non-alignment. I'm not so sure that applies to Ireland, but my research is designed to find out if that is the case. I'm conscious there may be people on the call or on the thing who are more interested and more knowledgeable about peacekeeping than me, but peacekeeping has always been central to Irish Defence Forces activity since the 1950s. We engaged in as soon as we got membership of the United Nations in 55. In 58, we were sending observers to the Lebanon. We're now heavily in the Lebanon, and we've been in the Lebanon since the late 70s. There was a period there when we were out, but we're back in, and we're making a huge contribution there. And it is an absolutely enormous contribution. But I'm wondering how central it is and whether we're changing in our contribution there. I'm trying to find out whether there's views or official thinking that says, maybe we should change the way we do peacekeeping or who we do peacekeeping with. There was, back in the noughties, during the global war on terror, some of the Nordic countries were disenchanted with peacekeeping, particularly UN peacekeeping. And I think it's very clear, and people have done research on that, including Professor Ray Murphy, that the Irish didn't do that. The Irish stayed with the UN and we stayed with the EU. We do both. And I have to say that what I think is a plausible hypothesis with the Irish is the Irish are specialists in peacekeeping. It still remains as vital and central to the identity of the defence forces and their activity. It's very popular with the political class and it's very popular with the public. However, peacekeeping is becoming much more difficult, much more challenging. but we're still invested in UN peacekeeping and we're still invested in EU peacekeeping. We do both. We don't necessarily see it as you do one or the other. There was a period of peacekeeping with NATO under a UN mandate. And there is still some engagement with NATO, but NATO as an organization is not that interested in peacekeeping for obvious reasons. It's more focused on the traditional role of territorial defense vis-a-vis Russia. There have to be questions about EU and Irish defense collaboration, cooperation, because that's actually what it is, right? Those of you who know the detail of the treaties know that Ireland secured a caveat in the wording of the text of the treaties, which basically makes it crystal clear that Ireland is not under any obligation to come to the defence or the security of any other EU state if they suffer an armed aggression. We have the so-called Irish clause, which was negotiated. However, we signed up and joined and participated in the PESCO initiative, which received a lot of, I might say so, hysterical commentary, both in the Parliament and outside the Parliament, when in actual fact, most of the academic literature on PESCO and most of what I've learned about PESCO is that it is a lot of countries collaborating on relatively small defense capability and procurement schemes. They're sort of buying things, or they're building things, or they're developing capabilities because they can't afford, and it makes sense to share them and to do it collectively. There is no question but that the EU has increased its ambition on defence. And so there is a question then about whether Ireland has also climbed up. As the EU gets more ambitious on defence, has the Irish involvement in the EU also signalled or risen with that ambition? Or have the Irish held back and said, do you know what, you lads and ladies can just go ahead there with that. That's for the Italians or for the French or for the Germans, but it's not for us. Have we got evidence of the Irish becoming a little bit reluctant, or maybe alternatively quite enthusiastic? And then the final thing is that small states are finding it hard to survive in a very confusing globalized world, which is turning into a multipolar world with new security threats. So the cyber hack that's affecting NUIG, and we saw the cyber hack affecting the HSE over the summer and the spring, that's become a kind of new normal. How do small states get it together, the resources to actually defend themselves from cyber hacking? Or what about hybrid threats, which is a new jargon beloved by academics, which basically means a way of engaging in subversion, which may or may not involve overt military force, but nearly always involves covert mechanisms of subversion, particularly used by Russia in the context of the Ukraine, where they basically seized, annexed the Crimea in violation of international law in 2014. And there's an ongoing conflict in the Ukraine, in the Donbass region, a frozen conflict, and the potential for Russia to do operations that would be similar to that in Moldova or other parts, or in Belarus, is significant. That is a significant and real threat. So what's the relevance of that to little countries like Ireland, who are quite geographically far away from that? But of course, they're all part of Europe, and we're all connected in a globalized world. So those are the research questions. And before I have only 2 more slides, so I hope I haven't destroyed your lunch or ruined your brain cells. And I'm expecting some good questions. But I think we've got to remember what I'm interested in is quite, it's nestled within, like those Russian dolls, you know, you pull off one and there's another one inside it and there's another one inside it. I think Irish foreign policy is the overall large set here, which sets the tone and the frame. And Irish foreign policy is actually quite distinctive, because a significant amount of our Irish foreign policy documents and our stances are values driven. They're quite normative. Irish foreign policy tends to kind of accentuate the soft power aspects and the normative aspects of foreign policy, which is quite typical small state behavior, by the way. We do, of course, have solid economic interests, but because we're so globalized, Ireland's economic interests tend to be very diffuse. In other words, what's of interest to Ireland is that the overall pattern of global trade and commerce thrives and is good. What is not in our interest is anything that jeopardizes that, whether it be a war in the Middle East between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or a conflict between the Americans and the Chinese in the South Pacific. All of those would be dangerous and inimical to our interests, but in a diffuse way, because they would mimic the COVID-19 economic shock and social shock, but actually possibly be a lot worse. So Irish foreign policy tends to focus on general principles of the upholding of international law is one of the consistent principles of Irish foreign policy. Then there is a national security strategy which has emerged. And I think this is very significant because I think Ireland could be an example of a small state that's beginning to replace the word defence with the word security. And the words are actually not synonyms. The defence actually means something a bit different from security. And I would put it to you that you need defence as part of security, but security is obviously more than defence. Now, those of you who are au fait with the debate on human security are well used to this whole thorny issue, but basically, there's a whole aspect of security that can't be delivered by soldiers or spending on weapons. That the spending on weapons or the soldiers or the defense bit only is appropriate for certain types of threats, which are the physical, violent, tangible threats. There's a whole other way of spending and preparing an action on security that doesn't involve soldiers, that doesn't involve defense. So the whole spending on foreign aid, and I was glad to hear that our foreign aid budget is over 1 billion in the budget, and I think that's a great thing. And that all is a contribution to human security, and it should be all factored into the Irish security stance. Of course, cybersecurity and more diffuse security threats, including threats from organised crime that tip into terrorism, that's primarily a Garda responsibility, not a defence forces responsibility. But that's all part of the national security problem, so to speak. So we're going to have a national security strategy which will emerge from the Department of the Taoiseach. It was the latest I saw was it was being finished in the summer. Somebody's going to tell me it's just out. But the national security strategy, I think, will feature very heavily in cyber and all that areas. What nobody seems to want to talk about is the defense bit, the defense policy, the role for armed force. What is the appropriate spend and configuration for an armed force? What part of that should we have as part of our overall orientation? And that seems to be under deliberated. And there seems to be a, let's not talk about that. And then in the purple, and the reason why it's purple, by the way, is this joint, because it's the Navy, the Air Corps, the Defence Forces talk about purple as the kind of joint kind of way of describing Navy, Air Corps, and Army, Land Army people. But I think there's a huge row emerging and a huge controversy over the whole provision of adequate salaries and compensation for people who serve in uniform for the defence forces. And the salaries thing is only part of the problem. There's also workplace conditions, there's travel, there's personnel issues, there's grievance issues, there's promotion issues, there's a whole range. And the Women of Honour issue and the systematic mistreatment of women, it would seem that is part of that, is a huge piece of work. And so what I'm trying to point out there is I think this makes me concerned that the actual defense policy will be the thing that won't be discussed or resourced or thought about, because all the time and energy and money will go on, quite rightly, fixing the defense forces in terms of their personnel issues and their human resources issues and the climate and the workplace and the paying conditions. And I think the national security strategy has the potential to redefine what security is in a way that somehow might forget defense. And Irish foreign policy will move on in its trajectory of integrating climate, integrating prevention of violence against women and children in a international conflict situation in Africa. But in order to action those, you may actually need to resource your defense policy and think about what that looks like. So the expected findings, and I'm on the final furlong marker now, and we're racing up to the finish line. So you can ask me questions. Here's what I expect to find. I don't know if you're supposed to do this anymore, but my PhD supervisor years ago used to make me kind of, what do you think you're going to find? What's your hypothesis? Because then you can disprove it, right? I think I'm going to find that Irish defence policy is a low salience issue. It's been kicked around between the Department of Taoiseach and the Department of Foreign Affairs and one or two other. I mean, we don't even have a full cabinet minister for defence anymore. That's telling you something about the salience of defence. But at the same time, there is an increasing politicization, as I described. There's all this social media echo chamber, which has very, very different constituencies who are all debating defence online, if you're interested in that sort of stuff. I think the second hypothesis I have is that the actual neutrality position has actually firmed up. It hasn't disappeared. I think there were some Irish academics in the 1980s and the 1990s. And by the way, the reference to a singular stance is a reference to a classic book by Patrick Keating from Trinity College, retired emeritus professor, much loved, still active, who wrote a great book on Irish neutrality called A Singular Stance. And there was a question mark, for how much longer could it survive? And I think a lot of Irish academics thought that neutrality would wither away. Once we joined Europe and once Europe got a defense or security dimension going, we would just kind of throw the neutrality coat in the corner and forget about it, and we'd take up new garments. But if anything, I think neutrality has become more locked in. And constitutionally, there is not a statement of neutrality in the Constitution, but there is a very clear statement that there must be a referendum if we are to participate in any military alliance. And that actually puts a firm constraint on any government's activity in that direction. I actually think there's zero political appetite for anyone in the political class to participate in NATO or join NATO or to join a very firm European military defense obligation alliance, which sometimes is aired by President Macron and a few others. The neutrality thing, if anything, is locking in. And if I can say so with my political science hat onwards, all you need to do is look at the votes in the Oireachtas on the question of PESCO. And you can see there that the two Civil War parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the two centre-right conservative parties, are pragmatic, and they will countenance lots of what I would call European military defence collaboration or cooperation, as long as it does not breach neutrality. But the rest of the political spectrum does not share that willingness to be so pragmatic. And the rest of the political spectrum, what you would call the plural left, including Sinn Féin, Social Democrats, Labour, the Greens, are much more lukewarm, and they will be participants in future coalitions. We already see the effect. The Greens have been in this coalition now since the summer last year, when the terms and conditions for the defence, the Commission on the Defence Forces were being scoped out. If I'm not mistaken, the Greens had a major impact in ruling out any discussion of neutrality. That was not going to be on the table. Whatever job the Commission on Defence Forces would do, it would not have a big discussion about neutrality, which actually is illogical, but politically it makes perfect sense. And it fits my thesis there that neutrality is actually stable, not unstable. The final hypothesis is that there's a few more, but the European thing, I'll borrow a distinction that Ben Tonra, professor of international relations in UCD, a much loved, great character in Irish political science. Ben, in a publication many years back, made a distinction between thick and thin Europeanization. And what he means by that is that some countries engage, not minimally, that would be unfair and inaccurate, but they engage only up to a certain level of ambition. And they certainly don't engage in a maximalist way in certain European policies. So for instance, some countries are not very interested in the fishing policy, right? Because they don't have big fishing fleets and so on. But some countries are very invested in that. Spain and France are all over the fishing policy, and they really want to dominate the policy. Ireland on defence policy, on European defence and security arrangements, Ireland is a not trivial, but not by any means a player. And Ireland has been judicious in seeking a role where we're not isolated and we're not left out, but we are by no means setting the pace. We're following, we're not leading. And the Irish are cautious about European security and defence policy. That's my hypothesis. Now, I might do interviews and people tell me, you know what, you're totally wrong there. And it'll be interesting to see what happens. Peacekeeping, I think the hypothesis here is that peacekeeping has actually become more important. In some ways, it's the only thing holding the defence forces together, because the aid to the civil power mission has declined. The aid to the civil power mission is technical speak for helping the Garda Síochána deal with terrorism and deal with organised crime. So that the people who do this at the moment are the bomb squads and the bomb disposal. They're called EOD units of the defence forces. And I should tell you that they've never been actually busier. In relative terms, that service is as busy as it ever was in the bad old days of the troubles in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. But there is nowhere near the level of aid to civil power support to the Gardaí that there was in the 1990s or 1980s. That whole important dimension that the defence forces were engaged in, securing the border, that is essentially gone. And because that is gone, it has allowed a steady reduction in the size of the defence forces, and it has also then resulted in a curbing of the pool of people, but also you could say the ambition in terms of being able to do many things. Instead, the focus is very much on peacekeeping. If you ask an Irish officer their biography, it's outstanding. It is absolutely astounding how many trips overseas they have engaged in, how many tours they have engaged in a senior role in a peacekeeping context. You meet officers who've done 10, 11 trips abroad, where they have often been in significant command positions, not just with an Irish unit, but in a staff setting, in a United Nations or even an EU role. I think I calculated for some other presentation that currently the Defence Forces has 6% of its troops deployed overseas on peacekeeping missions. And I was informed by an army officer that the norm internationally is about 1.5%. So Ireland is massively outperforming on a per capita basis in terms of peacekeeping. I would suggest to you there, though, there could be other parts of that story which are not so attractive or so good, which is that the peacekeeping is becoming much more challenging, and resourcing it is becoming much more challenging, and the cost of it and the expense of it and the threats are becoming much more challenging. Is that being debated? That's my question there. Have I got evidence that the Irish political elite are actually in a sophisticated mode of learning about where we should be going in peacekeeping? I will be happy to be told that they are, but I'm not clear that that is the case. Finally, the last one is that Irish defence policy remains a closed, I wouldn't say it's a closed shop, but it remains a pretty closed world. There's only a very small number of people who are the major decision makers on defence policy. And the overall major story about Irish defence policy is that the Ireland is very distinctive, not for the neutrality thing or the non-alignment thing, but Ireland is very distinctive for the systematic low level of spending on defence, which some of you may actually regard as a wonderful thing. That's what a wonderful example of a country that doesn't spend on defence. But the level of Irish defence spending is so low that it is anomalous. I mean, in another, I can show you graphs if you want to in the Q&A, but Ireland is achieving a level of spend on defence which puts us with Uruguay, a South American country. We are not in the tier of countries that we normally are, like New Zealand, Austria, or Finland, as we are for spending on higher education or spending on health or spending on other things. So on defence, the Irish are systematically underinvesting. And the great bulk of the defence vote goes on pensions and goes on salaries. That's the way it is in every country, incidentally. But what's significant is that the Irish spending on defence capabilities, which does include weapons, but a lot of it isn't weapons, is very low compared to other countries. And I mean very low. I don't mean, we're just a bit underperforming. When you compare what the Finnish armed forces or what the Austrian armed forces or what the Swedish armed forces are planning in terms of procurement, Irish procurement plans are incredibly more modest than their plans. And then you've got to ask the question, are they all wrong and we uniquely are right? That would be the question you would have to ask. Because you might have other questions you might want to ask. Folks, I've destroyed your lunch, a perfectly good lunch ruined by Brendan Flynn and Saka Paul. And what I would really welcome now is questions, but your only question might be, when can I eat my sandwich? But I would welcome questions which I'm going to go out of the stop share because that will make it easy. I've got one question in the Q&A. Neil is there and I'll read it out. Great talk, Brendan. Can you say a little about how military cooperation with other European states has developed? I'm particularly interested in the stronger links with the UK. I believe Irish officers go to training courses in the UK and with Scandinavian states. Yeah, I can, Neil. I can talk a little bit about that, and I think that's of considerable interest. So some years back, Ireland signed a memorandum of understanding with Britain and with the British MOD and our own Department of Defence. And that was, I think, partly in the context of, if you remember when the Queen visited and she bought some fish down in the English market in Cork, and that went down rather well, or whatever it is she did in the English market in Cork. So I think part of that was part of the overall mood music when hope and history rhymed, and it fit into the overall context of the Good Friday Agreement. But the more business end of it was that the British Armed Forces realized that the Irish Armed Forces had some real peacekeeping knowledge and craft and smarts to impart. And the British Armed Forces probably thought that they could share some kind of more operational and tactical level stuff about, particularly, for instance, how to deal with very serious injuries, where you have people horrifically injured, and there's a whole piece of work there about evacuation protocols. So the two armies basically are highly professional, and the Irish Army still has a British Army sort of DNA somewhere in the mix in there. Obviously, it is an Irish army, it's an Irish Defence Forces, and but that tension with the British heritage has always been there since the 1920s. I came across a very interesting story about how in the mid 1920s, Irish officers were basically were treated appallingly when they went over to Britain by Montgomery, who of course was active during the War of Independence. And there was no love lost, because a lot of the key personalities of our defence forces right up until the end of the Second World War were heroes of the War of Independence. They had even fought in 1916, and they'd been Michael Collins' men, for want of a better word. So we have an unusual historical trajectory for our defence forces. But the Memorandum of Understanding with Britain, as I understand it, is not doing an awful lot of work at the moment. There doesn't seem to be a great deal of engagement. And I think that's just overall got to do with both militaries now in relative terms are very small. You may not get this, but the British military now is an awful lot smaller. And so their ambition for interest and cooperation with Ireland in some ways is probably relatively lower. But Irish officers will go and do professional education, or they will do training or courses with a variety of other international players, the United States, the Scandinavian countries, France and Germany. All of these would be places where you would send people from a professional rationale that they would go. And you see some people there. John Leach is talking about, there's a plurality. There seems to be no great political strategic thought process behind that. It seems to be driven by, simple pragmatic professionalism. There is a very good course run in English over in Leavenworth, so let's send somebody over to Leavenworth. I should say that the overall financial situation is so parsimonious that we don't send large cohorts of our officer corps over we don't send as many people overseas for military training and exchange compared to, say, the New Zealanders would do. And one of the reasons for that is now the Defence Forces is so small, the pool of people available is smaller. So this is what happens when you get your Defence Force down to about effectively 8,000, because if you take into account people on cycles and different parts of their career, you actually have a very small pool of people available to be deployed for anything. So this is something that I think the civilian population maybe don't understand, but Defence Forces people do understand, that it's got so low. Michael Flood says here, you have not mentioned the Reserve Defence Forces, and I haven't, Michael, and I'm sorry, and that's not because I have any animus towards the Reserve Defence Forces, not at all. I think one of the slight puzzles about Ireland is if you compare us with other small states like the Austrians and the Finns and the Nordic states, for want of a better word, but you need to remember that 3 of the Nordic states are actually very active members in NATO. Iceland, Norway, and Denmark are NATO stalwarts, and they're not only active in NATO, they are enthusiastic and gung-ho about NATO, and they've been embarrassingly enthusiastic and literally gung-ho about participations in operations like Afghanistan, which I think is now proven to be decidedly ill-advised, and in no way matches Ireland, I think, in our mood and our political, our public opinion. But Finland and Sweden do have very large reserves. And I think a lot of the military thinking now would be that, you know, if you don't have effective reserves, you're not going to be able to run a modern military. And in fact, with the economics coming in here, the future may well be a much more blended military, particularly for things like cyber. I mean, where are you going to get people who are IT professionals? They're not going to give up their job in IT where they're being paid huge salaries to become a regular officer in the defense forces down in the Curragh as part of a cyber unit. But they might participate as a reservist, and they might have a value to the state as a reservist. And so you can imagine there, and lots of countries have thought about much more blended modern European militaries, where you have people who come in and out. They do 3 or 4 years as a regular, and then they're trained, and then they go back into civilian world, and they might come back mid-career as part of a career break and actually become what the British call a full-time reserve. I think our reserves have been very much ignored and underfinanced, and that goes back to something I didn't mention, which was the 2012 reform of the defense forces, which were really a series of cutbacks. And more now, it's very clear that a brutal Faustian bargain was put, barrels of a shotgun were put to the head of the Department of Defense there, both the military and the civilian side, and said, you either implement pretty sweeping cuts, or we, the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, the Grim Reaper, and the Department of Finance, the Grim Reaper too, right? We will come in and do it for you. So what happened there was major cutbacks, which had significant repercussions in the west of Ireland, because the West of Ireland Brigade, the 3rd Brigade, the old Western Command, as it used to be called if you go further back, that was just shredded. And there were significant dysfunctions, I think, have emerged in the defense forces since that date, which is 2012. I think I've got a few other questions. Nobody threatening to send the lawyers after me just yet. Thanks, John. Yeah. No, no. You mentioned China, and China are very interesting. And I don't know if Ray Murphy's here or if he has an opinion on it. The Chinese are now a peacekeeping player. They contribute huge amounts of troops to peacekeeping missions, UN peacekeeping missions with the blue helmets on and the white trucks and all the rest of it. And it's a thorny one, that how do you engage with them? But I mean, I think the answer might be that you have no option but to develop a good pragmatic relationship with them. So I'm not sure if there is, through the peacekeeping nexus, for want of a better word, an Irish engagement with the Chinese. I mean, they have a significant role in some of the missions, tends not to overlap with the missions the Irish are involved in. The Russians are a different kettle of fish. There's no doubt that you know, they wouldn't be the types of armed forces that would be the obvious go-to. The sociology on this is pretty simple. You go to the armed forces that you have that are friendly states. So if you're a liberal democracy, you go to other liberal democracies. You go to people who speak the same language, and you go to people who have the same type of militaries as you, which, as I explained there, Ireland's military heritage is very unusual. We have 1/3 of it is the old IRA guerrilla army. I kid you not, that's still there. And it comes up from time to time when you talk to people in the defense forces. And then another 1/3 of it is the British Army tradition, you know, parade bashing and all the rest of it, and swagger sticks and all this type of stuff that civilians like me or you mightn't necessarily get. And then another 1/3 of it is just how it's developed. I think the peacekeeping piece is quite unique. But our Irish military, you know, would have affinities with the New Zealanders and with the Australians, and they would have affinities with the British. When they go to some of the continental or Nordic armies, like the Finnish army, for instance, that's predominantly a conscript army, so which is very different in tone and in atmosphere from the Irish military. So military culture, strategic culture matters, I suppose, in terms of who you esteem and who you engage with. I'd say at this stage, people want to break for the border. That's what I'd say people want to do. I mean, the metaphorical border, not the border in the north, which is a nice way for me to raise one issue that nobody wants to talk about, which is if our country is going to be unified in the next 2 years or the next 80 years, take your pick there. Has anyone actually looked at the issue of the security and defence implications of a united Ireland? just asking the simple question, what will be the police force that will be on the streets in Belfast? And what will be the army of that territory constituted? Or will it be a demilitarized zone, or will it be just part of the Republic of Ireland? Or will it be some kind of strange hybrid shared sovereignty or something? I don't know. But I do know that people haven't discussed that or deliberated on that. There's a very interesting report by a bunch of academics, and a very good report on unification and how it might happen, and how the modalities of that could happen. And I think we need to discuss that. You need to do it in a very responsible way that isn't about sensationalism or scoring points that are political points or ideological points to frighten anyone or to scare anyone or to annoy anyone or get up anyone's nose. But I'm just alarmed that our country, once again, on something as quite important as defense, this is a void. Nobody's discussing this. Nobody's talking about it. But the implications, people sometimes say we can't afford unification. I don't know about that. I leave that to the economists. I suspect that's not true. But I wonder about, can a unified Ireland be secured, and by whom? There you go. If you get the answer to that, you can send it to me in an email. And I'd welcome that. Yeah, Neil is saying that they came up with a number, and I suspect you're right on that. Yeah, there's been a couple of people who did PhDs on the role of the Irish Army and whether they were going to cross into Northern Ireland. But I think the consensus is the defence forces themselves are very astute in pointing out that not only would this be a breach of international law, and remember how important that is, don't underestimate the normative self-bindingness, so to speak, of not being a violator of international law is for the Irish, coming from Ivy House. That's very important. That norm was strong, and that you'd be violating that norm. You'd be interfering with a NATO country, which would not go down very well with our friends in America. And there's the small matter that the defense forces just didn't have the resources or the capability to do anything of any ambition. They were stretched to do a good piece of work on the peacekeeping side. Indeed, it's forgotten now, but Ireland's contribution to one peacekeeping mission in Cyprus, we actually withdrew forces to send them to the border. So, you know, this point that those roles are connected, that's sometimes kind of forgotten. Okay, folks, I don't know if anyone has any other questions, or you're just blitzed now with an endless litany of Zoom meetings and presentations and stuff. But can I just before I press the leave button and people can go home, can I just say a big thank you to the Whittaker Institute, and above all to Courtney Yatta, who's organizing and doing all the tech support for all this, because none of this would happen without people like her who do this and make it all seem so seamless and easy, but she's actually doing all the hard work in the background. So thanks very much. If anyone wants to come back to me or have an actual real cup of coffee about this, and particularly there might be people from, I see Michael Mulqueen there, and I'm very glad you attended, Michael, and perhaps we can have a chat with coffee or a Zoom call. I really would welcome somebody to come in here and give me a chat about this, because most people aren't very interested in it. It's quite a unique topic, and I'd welcome any feedback, good, bad, or indifferent. I'll take it. But I'm going to sign off now, because the deal is you get out of here by 2 o'clock. Thanks very much, folks. Thanks for your time and attention. And I'm sure there'll be an equally impressive talk or interesting talk coming up with the Whittaker Institute in due course. Thank you. Bye-bye. Over and out.